Good morning. It's me again, possibly for the last time. There are certain trigger words which raise the hair on the back of my neck and get me thinking very dark thoughts about whoever has used them. One of those words is nuance or nuanced, in a political context at least. We heard a lot of that word in recent political campaigns, recent presidential campaigns, about how this or that policy proposal was nuanced or wasn't sufficiently nuanced. And the person who used the word was trying to get the audience to interpret it in a particular way, which is to say that the proposal had thought through a great deal of complexity, or that it hadn't, that it had adequately addressed all the ramifications of a situation, or that it hadn't. It's part and parcel of the political conceit of our time, the notion that the leaders we elect to our public offices are there because they know better than we do how to run our lives and our economy, that they're smarter, more knowledgeable, more erudite, more capable of seeing their way through the thickets of complexity around a given issue. That has an implied exclusion principle attached to it that excludes all but the best and the brightest, and the best and the brightest, of course, being defined as coming from the right lineage, having the right resume, having come from the right college or university, and generally being part of the political elite. The exclusion principle is then wielded like a club against anybody who doesn't have one or more of the required credentials. Recently, of course, we've seen it used against Sarah Palin of Alaska. She didn't come from an Ivy League university. She was governor of a small state that's not even contiguous with most of the country. Some very denigrating, disparaging terms were used against her. But it's also been wielded against Haley Barbour of Mississippi, Mitch Daniels of Indiana, Mike Huckabee of Arkansas, always to the effect that the person wielding the club was far better equipped to think his way through matters of national policy than any of these ruffians. At campaign time, this becomes an active principle. It becomes something that takes a part in debates, in statements about this or that candidate. We have intimations of insufficiency against the candidate who doesn't have the preferred credentials. The political elite will gang up against that candidate with a great deal of assistance from the major media, who have an incestuous relationship with the political elite. Sometimes this gives rise to fatuities. You have provably false allegations, statements, stories promulgated by the major media against the dispreferred candidate, even after they have been disproved. We had an example of that quite recently when Us Weekly published a story in which it claimed that an interview of Sean Hannity's with Sarah Palin that actually never took place was a fact, in which Sarah said some disparaging things about, I believe it was Christina Aguilera. And so anxious was the media to promulgate this slander that Time magazine picked it up and once again treated it as factual without bothering to check. Both publications were greatly embarrassed when the truth became known, but the corrections that are made in such cases are seldom enough to redress all the damage done. Let's look at that word nuance a little bit more closely. What does it really mean? Let's leave aside the glow of having thought through great complexity and addressed all the important aspects of a situation, which is the one that the person using it in a positive sense would like you to assume it means. What it really means, as regards a policy position, is that the position does not have any central principles that have binding force. Everything's an exception. There are no general rules against which one can measure any aspect of the policy. This has a lot in common with exhortations to pragmatism. Oh, we've got to be practical about this. Yes, principle is all very well in theory, but in this particular case or that, an exception is definitely warranted. It's a favorite retreat of statists with a technocratic bent, the sort of man who really does think he is smarter than you and more equipped to run your life. I'd like to read you something. It's from a book written 33 years ago by a former Secretary of the Treasury, William E. Simon. He was Secretary of the Treasury for Nixon and for Gerald E. Ford. The incessant spawning and modification of laws, regulations, programs, and national purposes are the expressions of a state which sees its primary function as controller of the citizens. The tragic fact is that this proliferation of programs is the only respectable form of political thought today. The definition of respectable coming from the establishment technocrats who emerge from the universities to compete for government jobs. These clever young men win the coveted power by publishing articles and books, which offer minute new wrinkles in the use of state power. Shrink it a little here, expand it a little there, the technocrat says, and the machine of state will creak a little less ominously and grow more efficient. He aims, of course, at being hired to supervise that growing efficiency. This kind of exercise produces the liveliest manifestations of political thought today. Our technocrats have taught people that only learned bickering over microscopic matters constitutes expert or profound political discourse. But learned bickering over trivial aspects of a pathological situation, and the struggle to make that pathology more efficient, will not help us. That is the language of centralized planners, and we don't need more of it. We certainly don't need more efficiency in government, in their sense. On the contrary, so long as our government remains in its present state, we are far better off with extreme inefficiency, for life can still be lived in the loopholes and the crevices between government's contradictions. That was from Secretary Simon's book, A Time for Truth, which he wrote shortly after leaving government service. Now, along with the word nuance, there's another word which we frequently hear in political campaigns, and which is normally used for its connotation rather than its denotation. The word is reform or reformer. Technocrats love to call themselves reformers. But to reform is not necessarily to improve or correct. It might only be to reorganize. That is what it means in the dictionary sense. The distortion took hold when corruption fighters of the early 20th century started calling themselves reformers, in the connotation of reforming some delinquent's character. In the usual case, the reformer who gains power does nothing to alter the correlation of incentives and penalties that gave rise to whatever he claimed to want to reform. Many a reform candidate, upon having been given power, has ultimately proved more corrupt than his predecessor. There's a lot of learning in studying the history of so-called reform movements. Most of them are based on a principle that is absolutely antagonistic to the American principle of freedom. The principle behind those movements has usually been, give the right people enough power and things will be better. But not once in the history of this country has that proved to be the case. Proper directions for this country require that we respect the original animating American principles. Government of laws, not of men. Constitutional limitations and charter limitations upon government. Individual freedom is the dominant principle. And the preservation, above all else, of the prerequisite conditions for revolution. The Civil War destroyed some of those prerequisites by compelling seceding states to return to the Union. I'm not going to argue that the secession of those states was objectively justified, but the notion that a state could secede if the federal government failed to honor its constitutional commitments was one of the things that was intended to keep the federal government in check, and today the idea has become unthinkable, not merely because of the Civil War. Also, we had the subordination of the state governments to federal slavery, with such things as revenue sharing and block grants and federal aid to education. Bribes such as those have emasculated the state governments. They can no longer be counted upon as forces for checking the growing power of Washington. What checks remain upon federal overextension lie in your hands and mine. The willingness of ordinary people to rise up and demand redress, possibly with guns in our hands. I'm not saying that armed revolt is the only one way forward. That possibility has begun to seem more attractive in recent years, but there are still possibilities that don't require a hail of lead. I'm not saying that everyone in government is inherently power-mad or dishonest, though that's a better default assumption than the reverse. And I'm certainly not saying that answering the phrase, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you," should be to draw your weapon. It's not absolutely necessary. It's just that at this point in American history, in our current devolution into a totalitarian state, I could hardly blame you. Good night.